Welcome back to another restoration video. Today I'll be restoring a pair of cool gray Jordan 3s. Obviously, as you can see here, the shoes are in terrible condition for their age. The midsoles have crumbled to such a point that you can even pull out the air units embedded in the midsoles. Alongside the midsoles crumbling, they've also fallen off the uppers and outsoles of the shoes. The other major issue with these shoes is that on the uppers of the shoes, some of the nubuck on the front and back has started to crumble off. Here on the back of the ankle collar, it's a little bit worse than it was on the tongues of both shoes. And to be as expected with a shoe that is 18 years old, the back tabs have completely crumbled off. Another interesting fact about these shoes is that whoever owned them previously tried to re-glue the midsoles instead of fixing them. I can't be exactly sure, but it does seem like they used some sort of super glue to fix them. Since majority of the uppers and the midsoles have completely separated from each other, I'm going to go ahead and take the stitching from the toe cap out. For this, instead of just cutting them, I'm using a seam ripper and lightly pulling them out just because I want to save the stitching since it has a specific color to it. Now with the outsoles removed from the shoes, I'm going to go ahead and remove the last large bits of the midsole from the uppers. Thankfully, due to the age of the shoe, I was able to rip the large piece off of it. And now with a lot of the midsole removed, I'm going to go ahead and use my X-Acto knife and skive off the rest of the small bits that are still on the upper of the shoe. Now before I start going ahead and doing any fixes onto the outsole of the shoes, I'm going to go ahead and use some acetone on the remaining bits of the midsole that are still on the outsole. Here I'm just using a putty scraper to scrape off the bits of the midsole off of the outsole, and for some reason I'm not exactly sure what the chemical breakdown is, but the acetone acts like an acid to the remaining bits of the midsole. And for the remaining little bits of the midsole that are still on the outsole, I'll go ahead and use the blade of my X-Acto knife to get the rest of it off. Now with the uppers completely separated and having no midsole bits remaining, I'm going to go ahead and clean them with a soft bristle brush. For this cleaning process, I'm also making sure to avoid the areas that have the nubuck that is starting to peel up, just because I want to save as much of it as I can. After I finished cleaning the uppers of the shoes, I went ahead and started cleaning the outsoles of the shoes. Here I'm using a stainless steel wire brush as it helps to get some of the dirt and oxidization that is stuck in the outsole. After this, I'll go ahead and throw the outsole into my light box for a few sessions just to make sure I get all the oxidization out of the white parts of the outsole. To deoxidize the outsoles, I went ahead and threw them in my light box for 6 11-hour sessions. But before I went ahead and threw them into my light box, I went ahead and taped up the areas around the white areas of the outsole just because I only wanted to deoxidize the white parts of the outsole. The other reason I ended up taping up the rest of the outsole is because I didn't want the outsole to lose any grip. As a side note, when I'm deoxidizing outsoles, I like to clean them after every session. For this, I like to use hot water and the mixture that I typically use to clean the uppers of the shoes, as I find that this helps the deoxidizing process. If you made it to this part of the video and have been enjoying it, it'd be greatly appreciated if you went ahead and liked and subscribed. And also go ahead and follow the MHS socials to see detailed before and after pictures. Now with the outsoles in the light box and the uppers of the shoes drying after being cleaned, it's time to make the paint matches for the uppers and midsole of the shoes. For the paint match that's going to go on the midsole and the back tabs of the shoes, I went ahead and used some white, black, blue, green, and red paint. And for the paint match that goes on the lighter nubuck, I ended up using the same colors besides blue. Now to fix the nubuck on the upper of the shoes, I'm going to have to get a little creative with it. Here I'm having to use the black nubuck pattern that I've used on previous restorations, since the seller that I usually buy this stuff from was out of stock of the lighter colors. So after I let this stuff dry, I'm going to end up having to paint over it with the color mixes that I made. To paint over the nubuck fix that I just did, I'm going ahead and just putting down the paint mixes that I had. Here though, I ended up putting the tiny bit into separate containers just so I can mix some 2-soft into them just to make sure that the paint wouldn't stiffen up the upper. For the back ankle collar panel, I ended up having to do 3 coats on it just because this color ended up going really well over the black nubuck. And finally, after a couple shipping delays, I finally got my donor shoes in. For the donor shoes, I'm just using a pair of Air Jordan 312 Legacies just because they come with the same back tabs and midsoles as the Jordan 3. To separate the uppers from the donor midsoles, I'm going ahead and cutting at the stitching against the strobe board. Since these donor shoes are pretty new, I'm having to actually cut away the uppers from the midsoles of the shoes just because the glue is too strong even after using some heat and acetone. While cutting the shoe, I made sure that I was cutting directly into the uppers of the shoe since I won't be needing any parts from them instead of cutting into the midsole since I don't want to damage those. After wrestling back and forth for about 20 minutes with the right shoe, I was finally able to get the upper off of the midsole. I did end up having to cut large chunks off of it though, but my Dremel will make quick work of that later on. Now with the sole separated from the uppers of the shoes, I can go ahead and start taking the outsole off of the donor midsoles. For this, I'm just using a blow dryer to heat up the bottom of the outsole just because this seems to work really well and radiate some of the heat to the rest of the midsole. I also use some acetone as it helps speed up the process of getting the outsole off the midsole. Earlier in the video, I ended up skiving off a lot of the midsole bits that were still remaining on the upper of the shoe, and here I'm just taking my Dremel and taking off some of the glue that was still remaining on the upper of the shoe. This will later on create a better bond between the glue and the midsole when I go ahead and re-glue the uppers to the midsoles of the shoes. Before I start painting the midsoles of the shoes, I'm going to go ahead and take some of the material out of them just so that I can get a perfect fit between the uppers and midsoles of the shoes. For this, I'm just using my rotary tool or Dremel with a sanding bit to sand off some of the original leather that was still on it and also take off some of the glue that was left on there. Before I go ahead and repaint the midsole, I'm going to go ahead and sand it down with 1000 grit sandpaper. For this, I'm just using 1000 grit sandpaper just because the midsole is already so smooth that I don't want to damage it by using cotton balls and acetone. After I laid down my first 3 coats of paint onto the midsole, I went ahead and sanded it once again with 1000 grit sandpaper just because it was a little gunked up and had some texture to it. Here for the back tabs, I'm just sanding them down with 800 grit sandpaper so that I can paint them before I glue them back to the shoes. For the back tabs, I ended up making some simulated stitching on them just to create the effect that they were stitched on. I'll end up gluing these back on before I go ahead and add the paint to the Jumpman and air lettering. Now it's finally time to glue the soles back to the shoes. For these Jordan 3s, I ended up gluing them back together in a slightly different way than I normally would. Normally when I'm gluing shoes back together, I go ahead and do that midsole to the outsole first, and then glue both of those to the upper. But since I'm a little bit more worried about the midsole to the upper fitment, I'm going ahead and gluing the midsole to the upper first to ensure that I get a good fit there compared to the outsole. The main reason I'm having to do this is just due to the fact that the outsole and midsole are created from different years, so that there's a slight difference in sizing. The outsoles for these shoes are a little bit longer than the midsoles, which is going to cause some fitment issues if I try and fit the midsoles perfectly to the outsoles of the shoes. Here you can see that there's a tiny gap between where the midsole and the outsole should meet near the front of the toe cap.
We must pay homage to him.